Thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for hearing my testimony. My interest here is not to question the rights of Indigenous peoples to clean drinking water or the jurisdiction that First Nations have over water on reserve. Like almost all Canadians, I find the lack of access to clean water experienced in many of our Indigenous and Northern communities to be a source of embarrassment. I understand it is a complex technical and political issue and applaud any good faith efforts to address it. My interest, rather, is as a policy analyst with expertise in resource development and Indigenous affairs. While I applaud the motivation behind this legislation, it is poorly drafted. The bill uses broad language and is ambiguous in its interpretation and application. If left unimproved, it will create unnecessary uncertainty and likely conflict for First Nations, landowners, industry stakeholders, and other levels of government. And it will be left to the courts at great public and private expense to try to interpret what is intended from the legislation. This is not in the best interests of either First Nations or Canadians in general. I will endeavor to be more specific. First, many key concepts are under or ill-defined in the bill. The circularity is best illustrated in the definition of protection zone. In the definition section, the bill states that protection zone has a meaning assigned by regulations made under subsection 21.1. But under subsection 21.1, it says the minister must make regulations defining protection zone for the purposes of the Act. Evidently, there is not, as of yet, a definition of protection zone. This seems backwards and unhelpful, especially considering the affirmations made about First Nations jurisdiction over protection zones and their prominence in the text. Similarly, the bill uses the terms adjacent and source waters without defining them, though they could be interpreted as meaning lots of different things and have very important connotations in the bill. And it consistently uses the term First Nations lands, which is ill-defined in Canadian law, instead of using terms that are well-defined. To me, there is a world of difference between reserves or land reserves for Indians, as described in Class 24 of Section 91 of the Constitution Act, and which the definition section refers to, and First Nations lands on the other hand. The latter is often used interchangeably with First Nations territories, which is often understood to mean most of Canada, barring Inuit lands. The spirit and intent of a term such as First Nations lands creates expectations that I don't believe the government has an intention of meeting. In the case of conflict with other levels of jurisdiction, has no authority to meet. I think it's better to be specific throughout. Other areas of uncertainty, the bill provides for First Nation law to prevail to the extent of any consistency or conflict over a provision of an Act of Parliament. But it does not say what happens if two or more First Nations laws conflict with each other. The bill provides that the quantity of water available on the First Nations lands of a First Nation must meet their drinking, cooking, sanitation, hygiene, safety, fire protection, and emergency needs. But it does not say what happens if the water available isn't adequate. And it commits the Government of Canada to taking traditional knowledge into account in all decision-making regarding water services on First Nation lands, including with respect to measures related to water services that can mitigate climate change. It's not at all clear what measures this could be referring to, how water services could either exacerbate or mitigate climate changes. I won't further belabor the ambiguous drafting of the bill, and I will submit my questions to the committee in written form so they are easier to respond to. I'm not a lawyer, and I expect the government has lawyers they can ask to tighten up the language. But I want to finish by making one point. There's widespread consensus, even from this government, that we need to reduce regulatory barriers and improve permitting certainty in order to get things built in this country. Major projects and infrastructure that we need simply to maintain our quality of life, things that most Canadians take for granted but are starting to be compromised, basic infrastructure and development that many Indigenous communities are still waiting to enjoy. And yet our lawmakers continue to pass legislation and advance policies that further add to that uncertainty, that keep investment at bay, and ensure the courts will need to be involved at some point in the future at great time and expense. Poorly drafted legislation does not benefit First Nations, but it does apply cost to all Canadians. I support many of the tools introduced in this bill to ensure clean water on reserve, including expanded jurisdiction, higher standards, and more funding. But I would respectfully request that this committee apply its talents, ensuring the bill is clear, constructive, and implementable from day one. Thank you for your attention.